The Ministry of Magic, at that hour of the night, no longer looked like the polished heart of wizarding government. It looked like a conquered city. Water hissed and ran in bright ribbons through the cracks of the black and white floor, where the fountain of magical brethren had burst apart under curses far beyond the strength of the witches and wizards who usually hurried through the atrium clutching parchment and briefcases. Torn paper drifted from the upper galleries. One of the golden statues lay on its side, face half melted, an arm snapped away and resting in a spray of marbled dust like a severed limb. The enchanted blue-black ceiling above, once a tame imitation of the sky, had gone dim and bruised, streaked with smoke and the ugly orange pulse of distant alarm fires. Cornelius Fudge stood at the center of it, his bowler hat hanging from two trembling fingers, as though he had forgotten what such an object was for. He had come in a rush, still red with indignation, prepared to see conspiracy and disorder and, if he had his way, one more opportunity to denounce Albus Dumbledore before the full machinery of the ministry. Instead, he had seen Lord Voldemort. He had seen him with his own eyes. Not rumor, not hysteria, not the frightened testimony of a schoolboy he had slandered for a year. Not one of Dumbledore's political inventions. He had seen the red eyes, the white face, the wand of yew. He had heard the cold, high voice ring beneath the shattered dome of the atrium. And now that the Dark Lord had vanished, leaving ruin, death, and a silence so total, it seemed to bruise the ear. Fudge looked like a man who had discovered his own house was built upon a grave. Harry stood several paces away, breathing hard, his clothes streaked with dirt and blood and fountain water. He had not yet fully understood the shape of his grief. It moved inside him like a blade too deep to pull free. Sirius was gone. The words existed, but his mind still struck against them like a trapped bird against glass. He looked neither like a hero nor a boy, but like something the war had already claimed and not yet finished breaking. Dumbledore, by contrast, seemed very still. That stillness was never softness. It was the stillness of a man who had reached the end of doubt. His silver beard, damp with mist and spray, lay darkened against robes scorched at one sleeve where Voldemort's curse had struck too close. The half-moon spectacles reflected the ruined atrium, but his eyes behind them were astonishingly clear. Harry had seen Dumbledore angry. He had seen him grave, sardonic, sorrowful, distant. He had seen the blazing force with which the headmaster dueled. He had never seen this expression before. It was colder than wrath and more frightening than raised voice or flashing wand. It was decision. Kingsley Shacklebolt emerged from one of the side passages at a run, tall and broad-shouldered, a gash opening his cheek beneath one eye. Nymphadora Tonks was with him, limping, hair faded to a muddy brown from exhaustion, one sleeve hanging in ribbons. Behind them came two Aurors. Harry did not know. Then Amelia Bones, hatless, monocle gone, gray hair half fallen from its severe knot. She took in the broken hall, Harry, Dumbledore, Fudge, and the scattered bodies and stunned officials beyond, and her lined face hardened with a speed that would have made lesser people recoil. "It was him," she said. No one answered. No one needed to. Fudge turned then with a strange, jerking movement, as though the joints in his neck had rusted. "We must—" He stopped. Began again. Thinner. "We must contain this." The word made something icy pass through Dumbledore's gaze. "No," he said. "We must end it." Amelia's eyes sharpened. Kingsley, though visibly spent, straightened half an inch. Tonks looked from one face to another, understanding arriving in pieces. Fudge blinked. "And what?" Dumbledore looked up into the dark balconies of the atrium, into the windows of departments stacked like sleeping cells around the central shaft, into the hidden passages, fireplaces, records rooms, hearing chambers and offices where ambition had worn respectable robes for years. When he spoke, his voice carried cleanly across the chamber, Not loud, but precise enough that even the wounded and stunned near the doors lifted their heads. "The concealment," he said. "The cowardice. The rot." A paperweight-sized fragment of broken gold rolled across the floor somewhere and clicked against stone. Harry found, despite everything, that he was watching Dumbledore as though the room had narrowed until only the old wizard remained. Fudge gave a disbelieving laugh that faltered almost before it began. "Surely, Dumbledore, this is not the moment for—" "It is the only moment," Dumbledore said. He stepped forward, and something in the air seemed to go taut. "Cornelius, you spent a year denying the return of Lord Voldemort because admission of the truth endangered your office. In that year, his followers gathered strength. They spread fear through the press, manipulated policy, bought silence, threatened witnesses, and nested deeper inside these walls. If we permit one more dawn to rise before they are dragged into the light, records will vanish, memories will be altered, witnesses will die, and men and women who have hidden behind seal and title will slip quietly into the dark and prepare this country for slaughter." "No, Vampire." Fudge stared at him. "Inside these walls?" "Yes." Amelia Bones did not flinch. "How many?" Dumbledore's answer came without pause. "Enough that if I named them to the wrong person, the list would reach Voldemort before the ink dried." The silence that followed had weight. Harry's head lifted fully for the first time. Kingsley's hand went almost unconsciously to his wand. Tonks muttered something under her breath that might have been a curse or a prayer. Fudge's face, already pale, lost what little color remained in it. "You are talking about ministry officials." "I am." "You cannot make such accusations here in the middle of rubble, of panic." "I can," said Dumbledore. "And I shall." He raised his wand. No one in the atrium moved. A thread of silver fire sprang from the tip and shot up the full height of the chamber, branching in 10 directions, racing through galleries, corridors, lift shafts, and office doors unseen from below. Harry felt the magic move through the building like a pulse through a body. It struck the fireplaces first. He knew that without seeing it. Then the apparition wards thickened until the air itself seemed to ring. The lifts shuddered and stopped. Somewhere high above, enchanted bells began to toll. Not the frantic peal of fire alarm, but something older, more resonant, a note Harry had never heard before and would never afterward forget. Amelia turned sharply. "What have you done?" "Sealed the ministry," Dumbledore said. "No flu travel in or out, no apparition, no port keys leaving the premises. All level access restricted to Central Command. All internal owl exits charmed to circle the building and return. Those inside remain inside until dawn, or until I release the wards." Fudge's voice cracked. "You cannot lock down the ministry." Dumbledore looked at him, and Harry understood suddenly how men yielded kingdoms, laws, and lies before certain eyes. "I just have." Fudge took a step backward. "On whose authority?" "On the authority," said Dumbledore, "of the man who has just fought Lord Voldemort in your atrium while your government slept." Even Amelia's mouth tightened at that. Harry saw then a small drift of red gold sparks falling behind Dumbledore's shoulder. Fawkes had appeared without song, silent as embers. Clutched in one talon was a black leather satchel swollen with documents. In the Phoenix's other claw hung 3 short lengths of chain attached to iron seals marked with an old crest Harry did not recognize. Dumbledore accepted the satchel with calm familiarity. "Madam Bones," he said, "I require every Auror whose loyalty is beyond question. I require the improper use of magic office sealed, the Department of Mysteries isolated, and all records of flu transit, wand registration, and hearing assignments from the last 24 months brought to Courtroom 10. No copies. Originals." "No." Amelia's eyes narrowed. "You planned this." "I prepared for the possibility that truth might finally become unavoidable." That was not an answer, and she knew it. Yet after a heartbeat, she inclined her head. The movement was slight, but it changed the room. Harry felt it happen. One power had recognized another and chosen, if not obedience, then alignment. "Kingsley," she said. "I'm on it. Tonks, with him. Bring Proudfoot if he's sober and Savage whether he likes it or not. No one enters records alone. No one leaves a sealed room unescorted." Tonks nodded and sprinted away with Kingsley, boots splashing through the fountain water. The Aurors with them followed at once. Fudge looked from Amelia to Dumbledore and seemed, for the first time in perhaps his entire career, to realize that command was something more than title. "Bones," he said, trying to reclaim strength and finding too little of it. "I have not authorized any of this." "You saw him," Amelia said flatly. "That is not the point. It is the only point." A noise escaped him then. Not a word. Not quite. But the sound of a man hearing the foundations of his world split open. Dumbledore turned to Harry at last. For one instant the iron in him softened, and the grief in the blue eyes returned, terrible and human. "Harry," he said quietly, "there are things I owe you. There are things I should have told you long before tonight. But if I do not act now, Sirius will not be the last life paid for this delay." Harry's throat closed. He wanted to say Sirius' name and could not. The world around him seemed too sharp, too bright at the edges, as if reality itself had been badly cut. "What do you need me to do?" "Go with Alistair Moody to Grimmauld Place when he arrives. Stay there. Say nothing to the press. Trust no owl you do not recognize. Tell Remus Lupin that I have begun." Harry frowned. "Begun what?" Dumbledore's gaze lifted again to the dark ministry above them. "The night," he said, "on which every servant Voldemort has hidden in government learns that I know their names." Fawkes spread his wings. The scattered sparks lit Dumbledore from behind, turning the old wizard's white hair and beard to silver fire. And in the broken atrium, beneath the ruined symbols of wizarding unity, with the Minister for Magic staring and the dead not yet fully mourned, the war changed shape. The Ministry after midnight did not sleep so much as listen. With the lifts halted and the fireplaces dead, the building had been reduced to its bones. Corridors once softened by convenience seemed suddenly old and secretive. Torch brackets along the walls, usually ornamental beside more modern magical lights, guttered to life in several departments when the ward magic overloaded the primary system, casting lean yellow flames across polished stone and framed decrees. Their light stretched the shadows of passing Aurors into long black spears. From the central security office on level 2 to the Wizengamot antechamber on level 10, Dumbledore's command moved like a tightening hand. The first resistance was quiet. A clerk in magical maintenance attempted to disappear behind a stack of requisition ledgers and found the doorway sealed. A senior undersecretary in international magical cooperation smiled too quickly and asked whether there had been a gas leak in the atrium. 2 witches in the improper use of magic office claimed outrage at being searched until the first opened her desk and discovered it had already been emptied by order of Madame Bones. A messenger from the flu regulation panel insisted he had urgent documentation for the minister, then tried, with astonishing clumsiness, to swallow the small roll of parchment hidden in his cuff. In other corners of the ministry, the resistance was less subtle. The team Kingsley led into Records Room 4 found the inner cage already scorched open, and a thin, harassed wizard from the Department of Magical Transportation, frantically stuffing transit slips into a self-feeding ash basket. He went white at the sight of them, fired one curse over his shoulder, and was down a second later under Kingsley's stunning spell. When Tonks dragged the basket clear, charred slips still fluttered upward like black moths. Some bore addresses Harry would later recognize from newspaper reports of raids and disappearances. On level 1, Amelia Bones personally broke the lock to a private archive cupboard adjacent to the minister's offices and found, behind a false shelf, 3 boxes of unsent memoranda and sealed hearing transcripts marked for destruction. Their dates stretched back 18 months. Some concerned confiscated cursed objects that had never been entered into evidence. Others recorded disciplinary reviews of officials later reinstated without explanation. One bundle, tied in dark green cord, contained witness statements from witches and wizards who had reported suspicious visitors, disappeared owls, and whispered threats after speaking publicly in Dumbledore's support. Each statement had been stamped with identical notation in a tidy bureaucratic hand. Insufficient credibility. "Secure all of it," Amelia said. "Yes, ma'am?" She did not move at once. Her gaze remained on the false shelf. "Who signed the destruction request?" The Auror beside her checked. "Assistant Undersecretary Wilkes." "Bring Wilkes." When he did not hurry quickly enough, she added, "Alive if possible." In the old hearing chambers beneath the courtrooms, Dumbledore worked with the patience of a surgeon and the urgency of a general. Courtroom 10, where Harry had once stood under false accusation while Fudge glowered from the benches above, had been transformed. The heavy chains usually reserved for accused persons hung motionless against the chair at center. The lamps had been raised to full brilliance. Long tables now lined the chamber floor, laden with records, ledgers, witness statements, confiscated objects, and a shallow silver basin the size of a washstand into which pale memory mist was already beginning to curl. Madame Marchbanks had been roused from bed and brought in swearing magnificently, all white hair and indignation, only to quiet at once when Dumbledore told her Voldemort had been seen in the atrium by the minister himself. Tiberius Ogden followed, shawl thrown over his nightshirt, and walrus mustache trembling with outrage at the hour, until he, too, understood the gravity of what was occurring. One by one, those members of the Wisengamot whom Dumbledore or Amelia considered incorruptible were summoned by emergency Patronus, escorted through the sealed building, searched, disarmed and rearmed, and seated. Fudge delayed as long as he dared. He hovered at the top of the courtroom steps like a man unwilling to descend into his own judgment. Percy Weasley, rigid as polished timber and twice as uncomfortable, remained at his shoulder. Hands full of memos no one now cared to receive. Percy's face had the stunned pallor of someone who had spent years believing in the sanctity of institution and had been forced in an hour to watch the institution bleed. "This is irregular," Fudge said for perhaps the fourth time. "War is irregular," said Madame Marchbanks. "We do not even know what is to be presented." Dumbledore stood at the pensive table, sorting pages with long, precise fingers. "You will know soon enough." Fudge drew himself up. "I must protest the manner in which this has been undertaken. Emergency authority cannot simply be invoked because you believe it convenient." Dumbledore did not look up. "Convenience had nothing to do with it. You sealed the entire ministry." "Yes." "You called members of the Wisengamot without ministerial sanction." "Yes." "You have implied that public servants, officers of the government, are in league with you-know-who, and yet you have not submitted a formal list of charges." At that, Dumbledore did look up. The old weariness was gone from his face. There was only clarity, and something so cold within it that even Fudge fell silent before he spoke. "A formal list of charges, Cornelius, is what one prepares when one expects ordinary obstruction. Tonight I expect sabotage, memory tampering, flight, murder, and the destruction of state evidence. If I had submitted a memorandum through proper channels, half the people I intend to expose would by now be beyond our reach. 3 more would be dead, and you would be asking in the morning." Percy swallowed visibly. Fudge attempted another tack. This could still be panic. A series of isolated abuses, a few compromised employees. It is irresponsible to talk of infiltration as though— "Your own office contains suppressed witness statements," Amelia said from the far table, not bothering to glance up from the sheaf she was reading. Fudge's head whipped round. "What?" "False shelf behind the tertiary archive in your private annex. You might wish to ask your undersecretary how long it has been there." Color rushed briefly into Fudge's cheeks. "I knew nothing about that." "That is not the defense you appear to think it is," said Madame Marchbanks. Tiberius Ogden gave a grim bark of laughter. The chamber doors opened then, and Kingsley entered with 2 Aurors and a bound wizard Harry did not know, perhaps 40, narrow-faced, elegant in the brittle way of a man who believed himself untouchable. He had blood on his lower lip where he had clearly bitten through it rather than answer questions. Behind them came Tonks carrying a charred crate of flu records. "Assistant Director Lascelles," Kingsley said. "Transportation." Attempted destruction of travel slips, multiple aliases, 3 concealed keys to off-site storage. Nah. Lascelles held his head high. I demand counsel. You may demand moonlight in a bottle, Amelia said. Sit down. He did not sit. He stood at the center of the court and smiled with faint contempt. This is political theater. There will be scandal beyond your imagining by morning. Dumbledore regarded him for a heartbeat, then laid one palm upon the pensieve. You are correct, he said. There will. He turned to the benches. Members of the Wisengamot, before this night ends you will hear names you know and some you do not. Some belong to branded Death Eaters who have hidden beneath ordinary office. Some belong to cowards bought by gold or blackmail. Some belong to those who have not taken the mark, yet have served it faithfully. We begin with the first category, simplest. He lifted his wand. The memory rose in a shining thread and fell into the basin. What you are about to see, he said, is a recollection taken from Severus Snape less than 2 weeks ago, combined with transportation logs acquired this night and testimony recorded under veritarum from 2 recently apprehended smugglers employed to move restricted artifacts between Nocturne Alley and government stores. At the name Severus Snape, Fudge made a disgusted sound. Dumbledore ignored him. The memory expanded upward like silver smoke and became a scene. A narrow chamber lit by green fire, voices in darkness, a circle of masked figures, and one pale arm extended briefly to reveal a burning mark before the sleeve fell. Harry was not there to see it, but if he had been, he would have recognized the graveyard voice speaking from the edge of the image, not loud, but terrible in its authority. One masked man stepped forward at mention of ministry channels. Snape's memory did not reveal the face beneath the hood, yet it lingered upon the hand, a long scar across the thumb, missing tip of the little finger. The figure was called by surname, Lascelles. The memory dissolved. In the courtroom, the bound man's expression had altered almost imperceptibly. That was enough. Coincidence, he said. Tonks upended the charred crate. Flu records spilled across the table. Funny sort, she muttered. Dumbledore touched another page. You authorized repeated after-hours openings of ministry fireplaces to private addresses not listed on departmental registry. You rerouted security alerts attached to the Department of Mysteries. You concealed unlicensed travel by persons later linked to Death Eater activity. And on the 31st of October, you escorted through a sealed transfer lane a crate containing cursed silver masks disguised as confiscated heirlooms. No. Lascelles' smile became something else. Fudge stared down at him as though seeing a different species. Who are you? He asked, voice thin. Lascelles looked up at the minister and laughed softly. A man, he said, who was not foolish enough to believe safety in office would save him when the dark returned. He moved before anyone else did. His bound hands twisted with shocking speed. The rope on his wrists blackened, split, and fell away. He snatched a wand from the nearest oar, sent a cutting curse across the table that burst 3 lamps in a shower of hot glass, and wheeled not toward the doors but toward Fudge. The courtroom erupted. The curse meant for Cornelius Fudge never reached him. Dumbledore's wand moved in a clean silver arc. The green flash struck an invisible barrier inches from the minister's chest and burst outward in a spray of emerald sparks that showered the steps and sizzled where they struck stone. Fudge gave a strangled cry and toppled backward into Percy Weasley, who caught him by instinct rather than courage. Lascelles spun left, already casting again, but Amelia Bones met him head-on. Her spell cracked through the air like a whip and knocked the stolen wand from his hand. Kingsley was across the courtroom in 2 strides. By the time Lascelles found the knife hidden in his boot, Kingsley had broken his wrist and driven him face first onto the flagstones. The whole thing lasted perhaps 3 seconds. But after that, the illusion was gone. The Wisengamot benches were in uproar. One elderly witch had risen so abruptly her seat toppled. Ogden was on his feet, face purple beneath his mustache, shouting for restraints. Madame Marchbank stood utterly still and pale, Her outrage hardened into something colder. Percy, one arm still half around Fudge, stared at the man pinned to the floor below as though he had just seen a portrait climb from its frame and slit a throat. Lascelles spat blood and tried to laugh again. Kingsley tightened the hold on his shoulder until bone cracked. "Don't," Kingsley said quietly. Dumbledore lowered his wand. "Chain him." The enchanted restraints from Fawkes' talon flew at his word and fastened themselves around Lascelles' wrists, ankles, and throat. Ancient iron bit deep into the stone, fixing him where he lay. Fudge was breathing like a man who had run a long distance. He looked not at Dumbledore, nor at Amelia, nor even at his would-be killer, but at the green scorch still smoking in the air before him. Only once it faded did he seem able to speak. "He tried to kill me." "Yes," said Dumbledore. "In open court." "Yes, because you named him." Dumbledore's gaze did not soften. "Because I was correct." No one argued after that. The next hour remade the ministry. Names began to fall into the room one by one, and with each name some portion of the state lost its innocence. Assistant Director Lascelles of Transportation. Archivist Morda Flint of Wisengamot Records, who had altered hearing dates and misplaced confiscation notices for nearly 2 years. Senior Clerk Basil Fenn in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, who routed dangerous object seizures away from secure storage and into private holding under false inventory. Mirabel Kress of Magical Law Enforcement, who had quietly flagged Muggle-born family addresses for routine review and sold duplicates of the files through intermediaries in Nocturne Alley. A pallid wizard from accounting who had never cast so much as a stinging hex in public, and yet had moved more gold into shell charities connected to old pure-blood families than some goblin auditors shifted in a season. Some denied, some blustered, some laughed with a terrible relief, as if the strain of pretense had worn them thin. One old warlock fainted when his secretary of 12 years was marched in under armed escort, and revealed, under forced sleeve and silver flame, the skull and serpent burned dark and unmistakable into her forearm. It was the mark more than anything else that changed the atmosphere from scandal to dread. A lie could be argued with. Corruption could be minimized. Cowardice might be hidden beneath phrasing. But the dark mark, seen in ministry light upon ministry flesh, under the eyes of judges, ministers, clerks, and aurors, was a kind of blasphemy the building itself seemed to recoil from. Dumbledore did not reveal it lightly. He had prepared a charm unlike any Harry, or most living wizards, had ever seen. A circle of pale phoenix fire drawn in the air around the accused, not hot enough to burn but bright enough to strip glamour, cosmetic potion, skin tones, false scars, vanity spells, and concealments from whatever flesh stood inside it. Over that he layered an old identifying enchantment once used during the First War to test confiscated robes, and cursed armor for trace loyalties. The combination would not create a mark where none existed. It would only force hidden truth into visibility. When the first branded arm emerged from smooth skin, as though dark ink were rising from beneath the blood itself, a collective hiss went through Courtroom 10. Fudge shut his eyes. Dumbledore did not. He had the terrible patience to continue. Roll up his sleeve. No. Both sleeves. The wizard screamed then, not because the charm hurt but because secrecy was breaking on him like stone. The mark came through in livid clarity, crawling from wrist to elbow, the skull seeming for a sickening moment almost to move as the serpent flowed from its mouth. Tonks, who had seen death already that night and would see more before dawn, swore aloud. Madame Marchbank's voice came down from the bench, thin and iron-edged. "Name." "Rennick Vane," said Amelia. "Position." "Deputy liaison between legal enforcement and ministerial security." Madame Marchbanks drew one breath. Merlin preserve us. He was not the last. With each exposure, the operation widened. Horror squads fanned through the levels with photographs, lists, and names taken under pressure from the already captured. Offices were sealed with blood-locked wards. Desk drawers were smashed open. Hidden fireplaces were discovered behind shelves. A locked cabinet in Dolores Umbridge's office yielded quills designed to draw blood, confiscated correspondence, and a tidy private index of students, employees, and witnesses marked according to usefulness, tractability, and risk. There was no dark mark on Umbridge's arm when Amelia had her searched, but there was enough else that the senior undersecretary's shrill outrage lasted exactly until Dumbledore began reading aloud the names of those she had silenced for political advantage. "I was preserving order," she cried, pink face shaking with rage. "You do not understand what these institutions require." "I understand perfectly," said Dumbledore. "That is why you are under arrest." She looked as though the concept had been invented solely to insult her. Elsewhere in the Ministry, things had gone beyond arrest. On Level 6, the Department of Magical Transportation lost an entire corridor to fire when two exposed officials barricaded themselves inside an office and attempted to destroy a cabinet of portkey authorizations rather than surrender it. The blaze was not ordinary flame, but cursed blue fire seeded through the paper shelves, leaping from memorandum to memorandum as if devouring government by appetite. It took 3 teams and a water serpent conjured by Kingsley to contain it. When the smoke cleared, one of the officials lay stunned beneath a collapsed cabinet, and the other had slit his own throat with a parchment knife rather than face questioning. In the Department of Mysteries, a door that should have led only to sealed prophecy records opened instead into a hidden storage chamber thick with dark objects never entered on any lawful register. Cursed bracelets, a pair of masks that whispered in Parseltongue when uncovered, a box of confiscated wands wrapped in ministry twine and tagged for destruction 4 years earlier, and 6 crystal files of memories, labeled on the. One shattered when Tonks lifted it. The memory within revealed, in a burst of color and sound, a frightened Muggle-born clerk being warned off a complaint by a polite wizard who later turned up on Dumbledore's list. "No one buries this again," Amelia said. The Ministry above them felt as though it were changing shape by the minute. Clerks huddled in offices, no longer trusting the colleagues seated 3 desks away. Aurors, still smelling of smoke and hexfire, moved with their wands already raised at each turn. The portraits in the minister's corridor murmured furiously behind their frames. Statues of former office holders, usually so smug in their niches, looked grotesquely solemn in the unsteady torchlight. Somewhere a wizard kept sobbing, the sound carrying through stone and broken waves. And through all of it, Dumbledore advanced at the center of the night like the point of a blade. He was not untroubled. More than once Amelia saw his shoulders stiffen, saw his eyes close for the briefest instant, as if he were listening to some far-off pain, and knew he was measuring cost beyond what the rest of them could perceive. Sirius Black was dead. Harry Potter had lost what little family he possessed. Voldemort had returned not only in fact, but in public. And now, with hardly an hour to breathe, Dumbledore had chosen to force every concealed conflict into the open at once. It was a ruthless decision. Amelia Bones, who had never been a sentimental woman, suspected history would either canonize it or curse it. There would be no middle ground. At 1:02, Rufus Scrimgeour arrived from home, still fastening his traveling cloak and carrying a scarred expression that suggested he had expected disaster and found something worse. Truth. His tawny hair stood ragged from sleep, and the old scars across his face looked darker in the court light. He listened without interruption through the account of Lascelles, through the evidence recovered from transportation, through 3 exposed marks, and the arrest of Umbridge, and only when Dumbledore finished did he speak. "How far up?" Dumbledore met his gaze. "High enough," he said, "that if we falter now, the Ministry will belong to Voldemort before Christmas." Rufus nodded once. "Then we don't falter." Fudge stared at him. "Scrimgeour." "With respect, Minister," Rufus said, though there was none in the words. Respectfully is for peacetime. The old building seemed to lean closer. From somewhere above, echoing down the sealed lift shaft, came the scream of another captured servant as the hidden mark was dragged into the light. Dolores Umbridge's office, seen at 1 in the morning under torchlight and accusation, resembled the private chamber of a particularly cheerful poisoner. By day it had probably managed an effect she imagined soothing. Pink draperies, pink cushions, silver-framed plates decorated with gamboling kittens. Lace doilies, glossy pen trays, polished teacups so delicate they seemed to disapprove of fingerprints. But the night had a talent for telling truth upon ornament. The pink walls sweated candle shadow. The cats on the plates moved in tiny, circular roots, their painted smiles curdling as the light changed. The ribbons tied to cabinet handles looked suddenly like restraints. One of the small side tables held, beside a saucer of crystallized pineapple, a black lacquered box filled with blood quills wrapped in velvet, as carefully as heirloom jewelry. Umbridge herself stood rigid behind her desk, both hands gripping the carved edge so tightly the knuckles had paled. Her expression was not yet fear. Fear required humility enough to grasp danger. What she felt first was outrage at the impropriety of all this. The entry without invitation, the handling of her things, the dreadful coarseness of being addressed as though she were answerable. "This is beyond irregular," she said, voice high and treacly and vibrating at the edges. "Madam Bones, you cannot simply burst into a senior office on the word of a man who has built his public reputation on drama." Tonks, kneeling at the lower cabinet with her wand between her teeth, snorted. "If there's one thing this room could use, is less drama. Do not touch my property." "Oh, I'm definitely touching your property." Amelia ignored them both. She held one parchment strip between finger and thumb. "Your index codes, circles for controllable, triangles for politically useful, black stars for troublesome. You maintain these on students. On subversive influences. Children," Amelia corrected. "Certain children are more dangerous than adults, as recent events have demonstrated." Dumbledore stood just within the doorway, not seated, not leaning, not giving the room the comfort of casual posture. The firelight from the corridor laid bronze against one side of his face and left the other in shadow. The result was not kindly. "You catalogued them as assets and liabilities," he said. Umbridge gave him a glance like a knife wrapped in pink wool. "I protected the ministry during a year in which you and your little celebrity sought to destabilize it." "My little celebrity," Dumbledore said softly, "watched a schoolmate murdered." Umbridge flinched, but not from shame. Only because he had made the room less safe for her. Tonks rose, with a thin packet in hand. "Found something charming." She slapped it onto the desk. Black and red seals cracked. The top page bore a list of names Harry would later know well, those who had spoken publicly against the ministry campaign to discredit him and Dumbledore, healers who had whispered support. Beside each name was notation, in the same neat hand as the student index. "Pressure point. Payroll vulnerable. Brother has gambling debts. Considered disciplinary inspection. Could be prompted towards silence." Amelia read 3 lines, and her mouth became a hard slash. "You ran a coercion registry. I ran a preventative registry. For whose benefit? For order." "No," said Dumbledore. "For fear." Umbridge drew herself up. "You are very fond of theatrical language, Albus. Fear. Fear. Darkness. Rot. Die. It all sounds marvelously noble in speeches. Governments are not built from nobility. They are built from discipline. There were rumors in every corridor, hysterics in every newspaper office, school children parroting stories of the Dark Lord as if bedtime terrors were policy. The minister needed steadiness. He needed loyal officials who understood that the public cannot be allowed to decide truth for itself. "No, Amelia looked at her. "That is the nearest thing to a confession you could have managed while still pretending to virtue. I have done nothing unlawful." Tonks opened the black lacquered box and one blood quill rolled onto the desk between them. "Try again," she said. For the first time, something like uncertainty flickered in Umbridge's face. She recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. "These," she said, lips thinning, "were disciplinary instruments." "For children," Amelia said again. and this time there was no mistaking the contempt in it. Dumbledore crossed to the desk with unhurried steps. He set his fingers upon a stack of private correspondence and separated 3 sheets from the pile. "You wrote," he said, "to Assistant Director Lascelles requesting discreet review of after-hours flu movements attached to names on this registry. You wrote to Archivist Flint requesting non-entry of 2 witness complaints submitted by Muggle-born staff. You wrote to a contact in Azkaban recommending the isolated placement of one Sturgis Podmore before charges were fully reviewed." "Nay." Umbridge's cheeks mottled. "Administrative recommendations." "You wrote also," said Dumbledore, selecting one final page, "to one WWNM, informing him that pressure upon the creature's office should be eased, because the minister preferred fewer public spectacles, while the school controversy remained active." Amelia's eyes sharpened. "W.E.M." Umbridge said nothing. "Weldon Macnair," Dumbledore answered. Even Tonks, who had already endured more than enough revelation for one night, went still. "Macnair's on the books," she said. "Officially, yes," said Amelia. "Execution services and dangerous creature compliance." "Unofficially," Dumbledore said. "He has served Voldemort for years." Umbridge's control cracked then, not into tears, but into something uglier. "You sanctimonious old fraud," she hissed. "Do you know what this place is? Do you know what happens when order slips? Panic. Die. Runs on Gringotts. International humiliation. Pure blood blocks threatening withdrawal. Foreign ministries treating Britain as a failed state. The Muggle Prime Minister sniffing around questions he cannot be allowed to understand. There are wheels within wheels, pressures you never had to manage from your tower at Hogwarts." Joe. Dumbledore's expression did not change. "I know very well," he said, "what becomes of a government that mistakes convenience for morality." Her eyes widened a fraction. Perhaps she heard, buried beneath the quiet, the memory of another ministry, another war, another clever boy who had once believed institutions could be bent into better shapes if only the right hands held them. Amelia tapped the desk once with her wand. Every drawer flew open. What had been hidden came suddenly and humiliatingly into view. How? Files bundled under false covers. A purse containing seized family seals. Private letters from Fudge marked confidential but duplicated without authorization. A velvet sack of ministry signet blanks. A small bottle labeled as sleeping draught but carrying, under testing charm, traces of mild compulsion potion. And under the last drawer, beneath a false bottom more skillfully made than the one in the minister's office, a thin leather folio containing copies of decrees not yet signed, half-drafted and ready for circumstance. Emergency educational restrictions, expanded search powers, temporary detentions without hearing, suspension of the rights of those deemed likely to incite disorder during wartime. Amelia read one page, then another. Her eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. "You prepared to turn panic into law." Umbridge's nostrils flared. "I prepared contingencies." "For whom?" Silence. Tonks picked up the compulsion potion bottle between 2 fingers. "For order?" Umbridge's eyes flicked to the door, to the corridor beyond, calculating. "You are making a dreadful mistake," she said, and the false sweetness in her voice had finally died. "The minister trusted me." Fudge, who had followed them belatedly from the courtroom and now stood in the doorway with Percy hovering behind him, gave a noise halfway between denial and shame. "You said these measures were preventative," he murmured. Umbridge turned. "Minister." "You said," he repeated, "they were procedural. That the school required a firmer hand. That Dumbledore was maneuvering against me. That Potter was unstable. That public concern had to be managed." Which was true. Fudge stared at the open drawers, the hidden decrees, the names, the blood quills. Was it? Percy's face had gone strange and hollow. His eyes were fixed not on Umbridge, but on the decrees. on the shape of the future that had nearly been formalized under his own nose. He had spent so long loving the ministry as an abstraction that seeing its machinery exposed in miniature seemed to wound him physically. Umbridge sensed the shift and lunged toward Fudge as though proximity to office might yet save her. "Minister, you cannot let this become precedent. Every office in the ministry will be vulnerable to political witch hunts. Senior staff will be second-guessed. Authority will collapse." "Authority," said Dumbledore, "has already collapsed. You merely hope to inherit the rubble." Tonks moved fast, wand flicking. Silver bindings wrapped Umbridge's wrist to elbow, pinning her arms to her sides with indignant efficiency. Her outraged shriek rang through the office like a teakettle boiled dry. "You cannot arrest me." Amelia regarded her in profound distaste. "For the record, I can." As Tonks guided the bound woman toward the door, the plate kittens around the walls began to mew in agitation at the upheaval. Their painted paws patted at the rims of their china worlds. Their bright eyes followed their mistress's exit with the same false innocence she had worn herself. Dumbledore remained only a moment longer. He lifted the folio of draft decrees and turned the first page. Fire from the corridor moved across the parchment. "Take all of it," he said. "Double copies. One to sealed archive, one to Bones personally, one to me." Amelia nodded. "There'll be more rooms like this." "Yes. You knew she was compromised. I knew she was useful to darkness. Tonight was for learning how thoroughly." She studied him. "And if Fudge hadn't seen Voldemort?" Dumbledore closed the folio. "Then I would have waited." "For how long?" His answer came after the smallest pause. "Too long." When they stepped back into the corridor, the ministry seemed louder than before. Not with ordinary business, but with the noise institutions make while they are being opened and forced to show their guts. Boots, orders, distant shouts, the crack of spells at some unseen turn, paper rustling in frantic hands, portrait voices raised in outraged disbelief. From several levels below, a bell began to toll again. Rufus Scrimgeour was striding toward them already, one sleeve singed. Macnair's office was empty, he said, but not cold. Hidden flu access in the rear wall. He left 10 minutes before we sealed internal routes. "Can he still leave the building?" Amelia asked. Rufus shook his head. "Not without crossing at least 3 ward points." Dumbledore's eyes narrowed. "Then he will aim for the atrium or the old sub-level drains." Tonks made a face. "There are drains. Built when the ministry was smaller," said Dumbledore. "Partly abandoned, used now mostly for maintenance and by people who prefer the state not notice where they go." Rufus drew his wand fully. "I'll take the lower levels." "No," said Dumbledore. "We go together." Fudge made a helpless gesture. "Surely, horrors." "Walden Macnair," Dumbledore said, turning his head only slightly, "has killed for pleasure as often as for duty. He will not surrender because procedure asks it of him." The torchlight shifted over his face. For the first time that night, Amelia saw not only resolve in him, but anger. Old anger. Disciplined so long it had become almost invisible, and therefore far more dangerous. "Come," he said, and the hunt moved downward. The lower levels of the ministry had been built in layers, not all of them elegant. Above, where ministers walked and clerks argued and enchanted lifts carried folders from office to office, the architecture preserved its polished confidence. Below that lived the machinery. Maintenance shafts, obsolete holding rooms, redundant flue conduits, archive annexes that no one remembered until a memorandum required them. Narrow service corridors cut through damp stone long before sleek black floors, and peacock blue fireplaces made the institution fashion. Some sections were barely used. Others were officially unused and privately essential. Water dripped somewhere in the dark with maddening regularity. Iron gates, once meant to separate secure routes, stood warped and half open on their hinges. Old ruins had been chipped from archways and replaced with newer wards, leaving the stone looking scarred. The air smelled of wet lime, rust, mold, and the sharp, acrid tang of curse smoke. Macnair knew the paths. That was obvious within the first 5 minutes. He had not blundered downward in panic. He had chosen a route that crossed blind corners, maintenance ladders, and the backs of storage vaults, shedding decoy magic behind him like scales. Twice Tonks broke through an illusion of a fleeing silhouette, only to find a pile of old brooms or a rack of broken stanchions. Once Rufus nearly took a curse rigged to the handle of a service door. Dumbledore dispelled it a heartbeat before contact, and the green bolt tore instead through the wall, spraying old mortar and black water over their boots. "He's buying time," Rufus growled. "He's looking for something," Dumbledore said. "How do you know?" "Because if he wanted only flight, he would have chosen upward routes until forced otherwise. Down here, he risks containment." Amelia, moving with the hard economy of a woman who had no interest in theatrical danger, swept her wand over a branching passage. The beam of light struck fresh scuff marks. He doubled back once. He knew he'd seal the west drain. Tonks glanced at her. "Please say you know there's only one east drain." Amelia did not. The passage narrowed. On the left stood a sequence of barred chambers marked with brass plates gone green from age. Decommissioned holding vault. Overflow artifact storage. Restricted disposal. Several were empty. One contained shelves of confiscated cauldrons. Another held a collapsed mountain of broken furniture and 2 cracked busts of former ministers. At the third, Dumbledore stopped so abruptly Rufus nearly ran into him. The lock had been cut. Not recently. Not tonight, but within a month. The slice through the iron was neat, darkened, and professionally re-welded after access. Dumbledore laid 2 fingers against it. His eyes closed. "Open." Rufus did so with a blasting charm. The gate flew inward. Inside were not cauldrons or furniture, but crates. 6 of them, ministry stamped, sealed with disposal glyphs that should have signified destroyed contents. Tonks swore. Amelia was already at the first box. She stripped the seal, flung the lid wide, and stared down at rows of wrapped objects cushioned in old ministry linen. Masks. Rings. Cursed blades. A silver amulet shaped like a coiled serpent. A bundle of slim wands snapped in half and tied together with black cord. The inventory tag fixed to the inner lid read, "Destroyed by order, W. Macnair.tu." Rufus gave a grim laugh with no humor in it. "Executioner's been skimming the graveyard." "Not skimming," said Dumbledore. "Preserving." "For what?" "For need. For barter. For the future." Amelia took up the amulet, tested it, and hissed at once as the metal tried to coil around her wrist like a living thing. She flung it back. Merlin. The old holding vault suddenly felt less abandoned and more like a cellar beneath a house where generations had quietly hidden evidence of murder. "He came back for these?" Tonks asked. Dumbledore turned his head toward the deeper dark beyond the storage chamber. "Some of them." A sound answered him then, the scrape of boot leather on wet stone, followed by a low chuckle that rolled through the corridor with hideous familiarity. "Not all, Headmaster." Macnair stepped from the shadow of the adjoining arch with an axe in one hand and a wand in the other. In daylight, wearing ministry black and the expressionless face of an executioner performing unpleasant necessity, Walden Macnair had always seemed brutal but containable. The sort of state violence governments insisted was regrettable while keeping it polished and fed. Here in the dark, stripped of office and watched by men and women who knew what he truly was, he looked almost relieved. His heavy frame filled the passage. Damp gleamed on his bald scalp and on the dark leather bracers strapped over one forearm. His eyes, small and bright in the gloom, moved over Amelia, Rufus, Tonks, and finally Dumbledore with something very near delight. "I wondered," he said, "if it would be you." "Put down the wand," Amelia said. He grinned. "No." Tonks's spell hit first. Macnair swung the axe, and the curse shattered into sparks against a charm worked into the steel. Rufus came in on the right with a blasting hex that smashed a chunk from the arch and showered stone over everyone. Macnair moved with startling speed for so heavy a man. He ducked through falling rubble, sent a purple curse low along the floor, and forced Tonks to leap back as the flagstones heaved like breaking water. Then Dumbledore entered the duel. There was no flourish to it, no shouted incantation. He simply moved, and the whole corridor seemed suddenly to understand it had become too small for the power inside it. Silver and blue light lashed the damp stone. Macnair's next curse folded in upon itself as though pinched by invisible fingers. The axe flew from his grip, whirled once, and buried itself 3 inches deep in the opposite wall. Macnair roared, lunged, and took one more step than any sane man would have taken against Albus Dumbledore. He did not reach him. Invisible force struck him in the chest and drove him backward the length of the passage. Iron gates screamed on their hinges as his body slammed through them. He landed on one knee, coughing blood, yet still somehow smiling. "That's more like it," he rasped. Rufus advanced. "You're finished." Macnair wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "No, I'm caught. Different thing." He snapped his wand downward. The vault behind him answered. At once every crate seal broke. Objects spilled and rose. Masks spun through the air. Knives leapt like fish. Chains uncoiled. One of the serpent amulets unfurled mid-flight and became, in a burst of shrieking metal, a silver-scaled thing with 6 human eyes. The corridor filled with cursed fragments seeking flesh, memory, blood. "Back!" Amelia shouted. Tonks threw a shield over herself and Rufus as 3 knives struck it in a line like thrown stars. One mask hit the ceiling, clung there, and began whispering in a voice that made the teeth ache. Another flew for Amelia's face, and she blasted it apart, only to have the fragments burst into black insects that clung to her sleeve. Dumbledore's answer was fire. Not common flame. Phoenix bright fire, white at the core and gold at the edge, rushing outward in a wheel from his wand. It did not burn stone or flesh. It burned enchantment. One by one, the animated objects screamed, hissed, blackened, and dropped. The silver serpent writhed once in the air before stiffening and crashing to the floor as dead metal. The masks went dull and split. The whispering ceased. Only Macnair used the distraction as intended. While the others fought the vault's curse storm, he had rolled sideways through the broken gate and into a drainage tunnel scarcely shoulder-wide. By the time the last chain fell, he was already vanishing into the wet dark. Rufus swore and plunged after him. The tunnel stank of stagnant water and old rot. Amelia followed, then Tonks, while Dumbledore came last only because he paused a breath at the threshold, gaze lowered to the blackened objects on the floor. There had been years of quiet theft here. Years of government seizure turned private arsenal. Years in which dangerous things had been entered on record as destroyed and were instead hoarded for the day when law no longer restrained appetite. Dumbledore marked it, fixed it somewhere in that terrible inward ledger of failures and consequences, and then he moved on. The chase became uglier in the drain line. The tunnel sloped downward. Water ran ankle-deep, then calf-deep, carrying bits of weed and unidentifiable gray sludge around their legs. Twice the ceiling dropped low enough that even Tonks had to crouch. Macnair left traps in his wake, snare hexes keyed to motion, exploding sludge pockets, once even a conjured illusion of a collapsed roof that nearly forced them to lose seconds detouring. Rufus took a shallow slash across the shoulder from a curse cast blind around a bend. Tonks stunned 2 maintenance imps someone had illegally bred in a side culvert to act as scavengers. Amelia nearly slipped where moss had grown across the stone, then recovered and kept going without comment. Ahead, echoing through the pipe, came Macnair's laughter. He sounded winded, but not afraid. "He wants us angry," Dumbledore called. "I already am." Tonks yelled back. "He wants you careless." They burst at last into a circular stone junction where 3 drain lines met under an iron-grated maintenance well. Water churned waist-deep around central masonry. Macnair stood on the far ledge beneath the grate. outlined by pale light from some surface lamp above. In one hand, he held a fresh wand taken from God knew where. In the other, he held a small black sphere the size of an apple, etched with writhing runes. Amelia stopped dead. "No." Macnair smiled with wolfish glee. "Oh yes." Rufus went pale beneath his scars. "Peruvian darkness powder?" "Modified," Macnair said. Tonks glanced at Dumbledore. "How modified?" "Asking won't improve it," Amelia snapped. Macnair lifted the sphere. "You people always thought the ministry would save you. Decrees, hearings, committees. Little stamps on parchment. Meanwhile, we built ourselves doorways in every wall you forgot to check." "You built yourself graves," said Dumbledore. Macnair's grin widened. "Then come and bury me." He crushed the sphere. Darkness exploded. It did not simply blot light. It devoured direction. The small lamps on their wands went black in the instant of contact. The surface glow through the grate vanished as though the world above had been torn away. Sound warp. The rush of water seemed suddenly behind and before, above and below. Tonks heard Rufus swear somewhere to her left and then not left. Amelia's sharp command was swallowed halfway through as if the dark ate words too. For one impossible second there was no up, no edge, no passage, only blind wet nothing pressing into mouth and eyes and lungs. Then Fawkes screamed. The notes split the darkness like a sword through cloth. Gold blazed overhead. The phoenix was there in the black, impossible and incandescent, his wings huge in the confined chamber, every feather burning with living light. The enchanted dark recoiled, shriveling from him. Shapes rushed back into being. Stone, water, iron, ledge, Macnair's face turning from triumph to disbelief. Dumbledore struck at once. The spell he cast was not green, or red or blue, but clear as struck glass. It hit Macnair square in the chest and all movement went out of him. He did not even have time to raise his wand. 1 second he stood poised to spring through the upper grate. The next his body lifted from the ledge, suspended, rigid, 2 feet above the churning water. Amelia sloshed forward and bound him hand and foot with chains conjured from the tunnel wall itself. Macnair found his breath before his freedom. "You think," he said thickly, glaring at Dumbledore, "that cutting off a few hidden hands changes anything?" "A few?" Rufus said. Macnair smiled bloodily. "There are names you still don't know." Dumbledore stepped close, and the phoenix light turned his spectacles to white stars. "Then you will give them to me." Macnair laughed in his face. Dumbledore's expression did not alter. "No," he said softly. "Not here. Not to you. And there, in the flooded underworks beneath the ministry, with the chains tightening around one of Voldemort's most brutal servants, and old corruption rotting in the walls around them, Albus Dumbledore made another choice. Not mercy. Restraint. Die. He would not become the thing he opposed merely because night and necessity whispered that he might do so profitably. He would drag truth into law if law could still bear its weight. That distinction, fragile as a wand shaft and as vital, held the line between war and ruin. "Take him up," he said. Macnair's grin had faded. Perhaps because he heard in Dumbledore's voice that there would be no rage to exploit, no loss of control to laugh at. Only relentless purpose. When they hauled him toward the ladder, water streaming from the chains, the ministry bells began to toll again above their heads. This time, the sound was answered all across the building. By 2 in the morning, the ministry had ceased pretending to be one thing. It was now 2 institutions occupying the same stone. The visible government, shocked, exhausted, scrambling to understand the dimensions of betrayal, and the hidden government, dragged screaming and blinking into torchlight, where its methods looked less like policy and more like disease. Courtroom 10 became the hinge between them. Witches and wizards were marched in under guard from every level. Assistants, clerks, liaison officers, advisors, 1 deputy head of a sub-department, so obscure most of the Wisengamot had never heard of him, and another official so publicly respectable that his appearance in chains produced actual gasps from the benches. Some bore the mark, some did not. Some had acted from fear, bribery, blood loyalty, or pure opportunism. A few, when the evidence was read, did not bother denying it. The old romance of dark allegiance was gone from them. They looked like what they were: tired conspirators, violent bureaucrats, ordinary souls who had bartered conscience for position until the bill came due. Amelia handled the hearings with brutal efficiency. There would be no full trials tonight. There was no time, and no sane person would have mistaken the proceedings for peacetime justice. But there would be identifications, binding, testimony, and preservation of evidence. Every arrested official was named, position recorded, wand seized, arm examined, office sealed, and effects cataloged. Every piece of evidence was duplicated under witness. Every statement was either corroborated or marked provisional. Amelia refused chaos the luxury of sloppiness. Rufus turned from hunter into commander without losing either edge. Blood from the cut on his shoulder had dried stiffly through his shirt, but he moved as though pain were a tax he had long ago decided to ignore. He deployed Aurors by instinct, shoring weak points, rotating the exhausted, ordering searches of departments not yet touched. When one young Auror hesitated before searching a superior officer's private case, Rufus took the case, blasted it open himself, and handed the stunned man the contents to inventory. Dumbledore remained at the center of the room, and yet, somehow, above none of it. He did not sit in judgment from the high benches. He stood on the floor with the evidence and the accused and the law, as though he understood that if truth were to survive the night, it must not appear too lofty to be mortal. Fudge watched more than he spoke. Each new revelation took something from him. Authority first, then indignation, then certainty, and at last, the last pathetic comfort of believing he had merely made errors rather than enabled catastrophe. Percy remained nearby like a man who had forgotten the correct use of his own limbs. Once, when Maribel Cress was brought in and identified as the source of leaked Muggle-born family addresses, Percy made a noise in his throat and sat down hard upon the nearest bench. He had known her, had passed her in corridors, perhaps accepted memoranda from her hand, admired her punctuality. That, more than theatrics or speeches, broke some lingering childishness in him. At 2:30, an elderly official from magical games and sports was exposed as a courier. The revelation might have seemed absurd had the evidence not been so precise. He had no dark mark, no taste for violence, no ideology beyond his own comfort. Yet for 7 years he had moved packages, letters, and coded fixture adjustments through sports committee channels because no one ever suspected Quidditch scheduling. He cried when Amelia read the charges. Not from remorse, Dumbledore thought, but from the intolerable insult of being discovered after so long. Immediately after him came a witch from educational standards whose mark showed in sharp black relief beneath the phoenix fire. She had worn 6 concealment charms, beauty potions, and a false scar over the forearm to distort any probing spell. When the truth emerged, she did not beg. She only looked at Dumbledore with flat loathing and said, "You should have died the first time." He regarded her sadly. "Many better people than I already have." There was something in the answer that made even she glance away. The pace became its own cruelty. Arrest, identification, seal, next. There was no time for anyone's preferred self-image. Titles dissolved. Personal histories became irrelevant beside signatures, transit logs, witness memories, accounts of hidden meetings, the sudden black crawl of the mark. The room smelt of wax, old stone, ink, sweat, and the faint singed sweetness of phoenix magic. At one point, Madame Marchbanks requested recess. Amelia looked at the line of prisoners still waiting under guard and said, "Denied." The old witch, to her credit, gave a grim nod and stayed awake by fury. A pattern emerged. Not random infiltration. Not isolated bad actors. A web. Small positions linked to larger ones. Records manipulation connected to transit manipulation, connected to enforcement delays, connected to private confiscation routes, connected to policy drafts and intimidation lists. The genius of it, if one granted darkness the compliment, had not been in placing a Death Eater atop every department. It had been in placing one obedient hand where paper became action, and another where action became record. Control the hinge, not the door. Change dates. Delay authorizations. Lose complaints. Reroute evidence. Apply quiet pressure to vulnerable people. By the time Laws noticed injury, the knife had long since been cleaned. This was built during the denial campaign, Amelia murmured at one point over a spread of linked memoranda. Partly, said Dumbledore. Partly earlier, the campaign only gave cover for acceleration. Rufus glanced up from a report. Who coordinated? Tonight will tell us. Or won't. Dumbledore met his eyes. Then we make sure it does. They turned to Macnair then. He had been chained into the central chair not because Dumbledore liked the symbolism, but because the old restraints were deeply warded and built for dangerous magic. Water still dripped from the hem of his robes onto the stone. He sat heavy and contemptuous, wrists fixed, ankles fixed, thick neck bound by the iron collar. A bruise had darkened one cheek where the tunnel wall had caught him. He seemed less like a defeated man than a dangerous beast caged for transport. Amelia began. Walden Macnair, employee of the Ministry. Confirmed Death Eater. Illegal retention and transfer of confiscated dark artifacts. Complicity and off-record movement of persons and objects through Ministry channels. Suspected participation in multiple acts of violence. Macnair smirked. Suspected. Confirmed, said Rufus. Macnair turned his head slightly toward him. You were always a hunter, Scrimgeour. Never quite understood that beasts learn the shape of traps. Rufus' expression did not change. And hunters learn where beasts piss. A few tired Aurors laughed. It helped. Dumbledore stepped forward holding not parchment but one of the crystal memory files recovered earlier from the hidden Department of Mysteries chamber. Its contents glimmered pale blue. Do you recognize this? Macnair's gaze flicked to it, then away. No. Dumbledore tipped the memory into the pensieve. This recollection was not from Snape. It was older and shakier, drawn from one of the frightened clerks whose complaint had nearly been buried. The courtroom watched as a cramped office emerged in silver form. A young Muggle-born witch stood in the doorway clutching a ledger. On the other side of the room, half turned away, Macnair himself spoke to another man about crate transfers and disposal tags. His face was clear. His voice was clear. So too was the name mentioned in answer. Yaxley. A pulse moved through the room. Rufus looked sharply at Dumbledore. Amelia's brows knit. Fudge, from the bench above, made a confused sound. Yaxley? There is no Yaxley on active ministry. There was not meant to be, Dumbledore said. The memory continued. Macnair named a route through security review. The other man, mostly obscured, laughed and said something about old families understanding how to survive changes in ministry. The recollection ended as the terrified clerk ducked away. It proves conversation, Macnair said, though a thread of strain had entered his voice. It proves presence, Dumbledore replied. Combined with tonight's transit records, the hidden vault, your correspondence with Umbridge, and witness testimony from 2 intermediaries in Nocturne Alley, it proves far more than conversation. Macnair's jaw worked. Who coordinated the network inside the ministry? Amelia asked. No answer. Who ordered concealment of the hidden storage? Silence. Where is Yaxley? Macnair bared his teeth. Out of your reach, Dumbledore said quietly. Not for long. Macnair laughed then, and some of his composure returned. You think dragging a few buried names into a courtroom wins you the state? The Dark Lord doesn't need a majority in office. He needs fear and weakness. He needs men like Fudge. His eyes slid upward toward the minister. So frightened of upheaval they'll call slaughter stability if it arrives in proper robes. Fudge went rigid. "No," said Dumbledore. "He needed them." Macnair's laughter faltered. Dumbledore turned, not to the prisoner but to the benches. "Hear me carefully. This ministry was made vulnerable not because darkness is uniquely cunning, but because timidity gave it room. Some of those exposed tonight hid evil. Others hid from inconvenience. They told themselves delay was prudence and silence was professionalism. There are always respectable words available when conscience wishes to sleep. Nah, namdi. Ganda, go, kermashe, beti, chi, doctor. No one moved. Those words end now. Something in the chamber shifted yet again. Not the frightened uproar of revelation this time, but a harder, stranger thing. Resolve, perhaps, or shame finding spine. Amelia felt it. Rufus felt it. Even Percy, pale and devastated, lifted his head. Dumbledore returned his gaze to Macnair. "You served murder from within law. I will not return the compliment by abandoning law in order to break you. But understand this. Every route you built will be found, every cache opened, every clerk you bought questioned, every record copied, every lie pinned to the wall where children may see what kind of men called it governance." Macnair stared back, and for the first time that night, looked not amused, but wary. The hearing moved on. At 3 o'clock precisely, an Auror patrol brought in 2 members of the flu regulation panel discovered attempting to escape through a bricked-up inspection hearth on level 6. Both bore the mark. At 3:12, a records witch confessed under Veritaserum that she had received instructions through anonymous memoranda written in green ink and signed only with a wax seal shaped like a thorn. At 3:27, another hidden cabinet yielded correspondence connecting the ministry network to 3 old pure-blood estates and a wine merchant in Diagon Alley who served as meeting cover for men too proud to gather openly in Nocturne. Names multiplied. So did clarity. The war, Dumbledore realized, had always wished to be understood too simply. Masks and monsters, chosen good and chosen evil. It was easier that way for children and columnists and ministers. But real corruption preferred layered rooms, filed forms, soft voices, and people willing to do one ugly thing if it preserved the appearance of order. That was why the ministry mattered. Not because it could kill with a wand more expertly than Voldemort's followers, but because it could teach a nation to accept rot as administration. Tonight, in torchlight and exhaustion, that lesson was being dragged backward. No one knew yet what morning would make of it. But by then, the state would at least be awake. The archive chamber that finally gave them the network's shape had been hidden in plain sight. It lay behind the Public Conduct Review Office, a department so minor and so tediously named that few beyond bureaucratic climbers ever noticed it existed. The front rooms contained precisely what their brass plates promised: shelves of disciplinary pamphlets, old copies of civility decrees, reports on clerk punctuality, noise complaints, inter-office grievances, petitions from magical janitors about corridor polish, and boxes of ancient behavioral guidelines no one had cited in decades. It was an office designed to be invisible because invisibility itself was its function. The back room, however, was protected by no ordinary lock. Rufus found the first clue when a low-level clerk insisted too vehemently that there was no rear wall. The second came when Tonks, passing on nothing more than instinct, noticed soot marks beneath a filing cabinet whose fireplace had supposedly been disconnected 10 years. Amelia ordered the office cleared. The cabinet was moved. Behind it lay not brick, but brick-like illusion over old oak. 3 seals sat upon the hidden door, each disguised as water stains. One carried thorn-shaped wax. Dumbledore's mouth thinned. "He was careful," Amelia said. "Until tonight," Dumbledore answered. The counterwards were ugly. They drew blood from fingertips placed upon the door and attempted to map the bloodline against a registry of permitted family names. When Amelia touched the first seal with her wand, it hissed and spat black sparks. Rufus triggered a cursed sleeping mechanism in the third seal that would have put half the corridor into enchanted unconsciousness for 6 hours if Dumbledore had not seen it in time. Tonks, grimly delighted by a challenge she could strike back at, picked apart the false brick illusion thread by thread while muttering insults to its parentage. At last, Dumbledore laid his palm on the wood and spoke a phrase in a language older than the Ministry. The door opened inward. Within waited not treasure, but administration refined into treachery. A narrow room, windowless, lined on both sides with pigeonholes and cabinets. At its center, a long table on which lay maps of the Ministry, Diagon Alley, Hogsmeade, and Wizarding districts across Britain, marked in tiny colored pins. Beside them were lists, not of laws, but people. Asset review. Pressure points. Hearing influences. Press contacts. Blood status leverage. Family vulnerabilities. Patronage chains. A nation disassembled into usable weaknesses. Amelia read one list and sat down abruptly on the nearest chair as if her knees had forgotten their trade. Rufus swore under his breath with a violence that would have shocked junior officers. Tonks stood motionless, holding a stack of sealed letters and not yet opening them, as though some primitive part of her knew that once broken, the night would darken further. Dumbledore moved to the far end of the table. There, beneath a paperweight carved in the shape of a serpent's head, rested a thin ledger bound in green leather with no title on the spine. He opened it. The handwriting varied across the first pages, then stabilized. Notes, routes, payments, names, adjustments to staffing, recommendations for promotions or delays, complaints to bury, families to cultivate, officials to flatter, minor pure-blood grievances to amplify until they seemed existential, Muggle-born applicants to bog down in review, departments whose heads were too stubborn to corrupt, and so should instead be isolated administratively until resignation or irrelevance solved the problem. There was intelligence here of a kind, but not the romantic kind so loved by war novels. This was the patient cruelty of men who believed the state belonged most naturally to them, and that all other inhabitants of it were tenants to be managed. Near the middle of the ledger, a name recurred often enough to become an axis. Yaxley Dye. Sometimes initial only, sometimes surname. Once, on a page later than the rest, the full flourish of confidence. Corbin Yaxley advises caution until public acknowledgement of return. Ministry fear useful, if not excessive. Rufus took the ledger and read the line twice. He wasn't merely in contact, he was directing. Not alone, Amelia said. She held up a separate bundle of correspondence tied with dark green cord. Look at the signatures. 3 hands, sometimes 4. Old families, Tonks said, finally opening the letters she carried. Some of this isn't office business at all. It's invitations, dinners, charity boards, donation drives. Dumbledore's eyes traveled over the maps. Because office business was never enough, they built a social skeleton beneath the administrative one. Influence at table, influence in corridor, influence in records. Tonks unfolded another letter. This one's from a wine merchant in Diagon Alley. Private tastings every fortnight for concerned heritage patrons. Rufus grunted. Concerned heritage patrons can kiss my... Rufus, Amelia said. Well, they can. The maps were worse than the letters. Pins marked not simply ministry offices but homes, businesses, committee memberships, school affiliations, social clubs, editorial connections, ministry wives and husbands, brothers with gambling debts, cousins married into old families. People who might be coaxed, people who might be frightened, people who might be ruined if public scrutiny fell in the correct place. One color indicated known opposition to Dumbledore. Another indicated soft targets for influence. A third marked those whose disappearance would, according to a note in the margin, produce useful caution without political overreaction. Tonks swallowed. They gamed the whole country. Or thought they did, Amelia said, though the fury in her voice admitted how near they had come. Dumbledore found in one drawer a packet of daily profit notes and draft headlines. Some had indeed run, others had not. Skepticism over Hogwarts instability. Minister urges calm. Calls for oversight intensify. Others were uglier and more direct, intended clearly for use should the right crisis arise. Radical headmaster linked to panic campaign. Boy witness known for attention-seeking. Emergency powers necessary after magical unrest. There, too, were handwritten talking points that had traveled from this hidden room outward into public mouthpieces, until lies and insinuations sounded spontaneous. Rita would have loved half of these, Tonks said bitterly. She was not the only one, Dumbledore replied. Near the bottom shelf, Amelia discovered personnel review files. Some altered, some forged, some awaiting deployment. A promising Muggle-born candidate for a security role had been quietly marked unstable due to family volatility. An older pure-blood official with excellent performance and private debts had been tagged cultival. A witch whose husband had spoken in support of Dumbledore had received 3 negative annotations in unrelated departments within 6 months. None alone enough to provoke formal complaint. Together enough to bend a life. Small injuries, Amelia murmured. Always small ones. Until the victim breaks, said Dumbledore. She looked up at him. You've seen this before. He did not answer at once. The silence itself was answer enough. There were times, rare and dangerous, when those near Albus Dumbledore glimpsed beneath the grandfatherliness, beneath the schoolmaster patience, beneath even the formidable duelist, the memory of the young man he had once been. Brilliant, arrogant, tempted by systems grand enough to absorb individual pain into future good. It was never fully visible. Perhaps it never would be. But in rooms like this, among ledgers that reduced people to leverage, he looked as though he recognized not only the enemy's method, but its seduction. He closed the profit folder very carefully. Copy everything, he said. Then seal the room under triple authority. Rufus glanced at him. We should use some of it. The words hung there. Amelia did not pretend not to understand. The maps, the leverage notes, the vulnerabilities, all the machinery of pressure. They could turn pieces of it now, frighten the half-loyal into speech, pressure pure-blood families, manipulate the press back the other way, wage war not only with law and force, but with the same sharp administrative cruelty their enemies had employed. Tonks looked between them, reading the thought with sudden clarity. Dumbledore shook his head. No, Rufus exhaled. That wasn't a fully formed suggestion. It was enough of one. We are at war. Yes, and men will die if we fight clean against those who don't. Many men will die, Dumbledore said quietly. If we teach the Ministry that salvation lies in mastering the methods that poisoned it. Rufus's jaw hardened. You'd rather lose? No, I would rather win something worth having. The answer left no room. Yet it did not dismiss the danger. Dumbledore knew, perhaps better than any of them, how fragile such distinctions looked when weighed against blood. He knew, too, that every man who claimed necessity eventually grew fond of it. Amelia broke the tension by lifting another folder. We still may not have the top. No, Dumbledore said, but now we know the shape of the peak. He turned pages until one notation caught his eye. A series of meeting symbols attached to dates, locations, and cryptic initials. One of the most recent had occurred not in Diagon Alley, nor in an old manor house, but inside the Ministry itself, Upper Committee Chamber B, officially unused during renovation. The last entry beside it read, after public acknowledgement, immediate repositioning. Thorn seal transferred to secondary custodian if exposure risk rises. Secondary custodian? Amelia asked. Someone still unaccounted for, said Rufus. Tonks swore again, wearily this time. How many more? Dumbledore traced a line below the entry. There, hastily written, perhaps during some interruption, were 3 words. Ministerial private correspondence. Fudge. For the first time in hours, true alarm touched Amelia's face. You think they got to him directly? Not necessarily, Dumbledore said. but they built roots close enough to his office to smell the ink, which was almost worse. In that instant, the night's work ceased being only exposure and became also triage. If the private correspondence of the minister had been compromised, read, copied, steered, then international contacts, departmental appointments, even negotiations with foreign ministries might have been influenced without leaving fingerprints visible to any ordinary review. Rufus was already moving. "I'll get the annex sealed." "No," Dumbledore said sharply, and for the first time all night the force in his voice cracked like thunder in the small room. "Not you, not Amelia, not anyone without me." They stared. Dumbledore held the ledger in one hand and looked for a breath. Older than the room, older than grief, older perhaps than victory. "If they place contingencies there," he said, "they will not be meant for clerks." Amelia understood first. "Dark magic." "Yes." Tonks grimaced. "Lovely." Rufus checked his wand. "Then we all go." Dumbledore nodded. When they emerged from the hidden archive, the corridor beyond seemed changed simply because they were changed. Two frightened junior clerks flattened themselves against the wall to let them pass. An Auror captain asked if the east stair had been cleared. Somewhere a healer moved fast with a floating case of potions and a face like carved chalk. The bells still tolled at intervals, though now the sound had taken on another quality. Not only warning, but summons. The ministry was no longer a sleeping bureaucracy. It was a citadel under internal siege. And near its heart, if the ledger told truth, lay one more chamber into which corruption had reached a hand too close to the throne. The minister's private annex had always smelled faintly of clove polish, expensive parchment, and the vanity of men who believed history cared how their office was furnished. It was larger than the public rooms suggested. Behind the formal office where petitions were received and press comments shaped, a private suite held a consultation chamber, a study, a narrow dining room for discreet lunches, a secure correspondence room, and an archive cupboard already disgraced once that night by hidden witness statements. The carpets were thicker, the curtains heavier. Portraits here depicted former ministers at flattering angles rather than simply official ones. A silver stand in the study held a decanter and cut crystal glasses. There was to one side a locked cabinet containing gifts from foreign magical delegations. Percy had probably catalogued them with reverence. Now the whole suite felt wrong. Fudge felt it before anyone named it. He paused in the consultation room doorway, hand tightening around the frame, and stared across the familiar furniture with an expression Harry might have worn if Grimmauld Place had opened its doors to reveal strangers in every armchair. The room was neat, impeccably neat. Papers stacked, chairs aligned, ink bottles capped. But the order itself seemed too deliberate, as though someone had restored stillness after violence. "Who's been in here?" Amelia asked. Percy swallowed. "The minister. Myself. Assistant Undersecretary Wilkes before he disappeared. Madam Umbridge when summoned. 2 cleaners on rotation. No one else without authorization. Nani, ba, ben, yabdo, na, kabdeni, fra." Dumbledore had already crossed the carpet. He did not touch desk or curtain or correspondence trays. He stopped in the middle of the room and lowered his wand until the tip hovered inches above the floorboards. The polished timber beneath the carpet edge writhed. Not physically. Not in any mundane sense. Yet anyone watching closely could see shadow move against the grain as though black liquid lived beneath lacquer. It gathered around chair legs and the skirting boards, then fled from the wand light and gathered elsewhere. "Step back," Dumbledore said. Fudge obeyed at once. Rufus shut the door behind them. Amelia took the left wall. Tonks, pale from fatigue but still dangerous, guarded the inner passage to the correspondence room. Percy remained where he was, not from courage, but because his mind had stopped issuing useful commands to his legs. "What is it?" he whispered. "A listening ward," Dumbledore said, "married to a copying charm and armed with a blood-triggered curse." Fudge made a choked sound. In my private office? In 3 of your private rooms, I think. How long? Dumbledore closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, reading old magic the way other men might read smoke. At least 9 months, possibly longer. Fudge went so still he might have been petrified. All correspondence in or out? Amelia asked. Anything laid upon the primary desk. Anything spoken above a certain volume within the room. Perhaps more. Rufus's face darkened. Merlin. Percy stared at the desk as if it had personally betrayed him. Dumbledore moved at last. The unmaking of the ward was delicate and ugly. He traced 3 runes in the air, spoke 2 counterphrases too old for any but the most learned to follow, and then drove the tip of his wand down, not into the wood, but into the shadow beneath it. The room convulsed. Every candle guttered sideways. Black lines shot like cracks through the floorboards, raced up the legs of the desk, and burst from the blotter in a spray of green sparks. One of the portraits screamed. Tonks yanked Percy backward as a thin jet of venomous darkness snapped from the inkstand to the place where his chest had been an instant earlier. The curse struck the far wall and ate a hand-sized hole through oak paneling before dying. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Fudge sat down hard upon the nearest chair, missed part of it, and only just caught himself. 9 months, he said blankly. Amelia opened the correspondence drawer with a shield charm already raised. Inside lay what one expected: letters, sealed dispatches, drafts, appointment requests, and one did not. A flat black plate no larger than a saucer, ruined at the rim and slick with old magic. Hairline threads led from it into the wood of the desk and out beneath the carpet. Portable receiver, Dumbledore said. Crude, but effective. Rufus took an involuntary step nearer. Can it be traced? Perhaps, if whoever held the twin has not destroyed it. Tonks kicked back the carpet. More black threads lay beneath, woven with silver wire and human hair into a net that spread under the furniture like fungus. It had been laid not by a dilettante, but by someone patient, technically capable, and secure in access. Percy found his voice at last. It sounded thin and young. I checked the office wards. Every morning. Yes, said Dumbledore. This one was designed for ordinary checks to glide over. Percy's ears went red. Then I failed. The words were quiet, but they changed the room almost as much as the exposed curse. Fudge looked at him. Amelia looked away. Rufus pretended to be studying the wires. Dumbledore did not soften the truth, but neither did he leave the young man alone beneath it. You served what you believed to be stability, he said. Tonight, you may choose whether to serve truth. Percy swallowed. How? By remembering everything. The young man blinked. Everything? Who had access? Who delayed reviews? Who encouraged certain memos? Which letters were rerouted? Which names caused unusual reactions? Every small oddity you dismissed because administration trains good people to ignore what does not fit the form. Percy's face changed by degrees. Not healed. Not redeemed. But steadied. A purpose placed in hands that had been empty. I can do that, he said. I know. While Amelia catalogued the cursed apparatus and Rufus began sealing the annex room by room, Dumbledore moved into the private correspondence chamber beyond. It was smaller, windowless, lined with pigeonholes and dispatch trays. Here the sabotage had been more intimate. Several letters had been opened and resealed so expertly the eye alone would never have caught it. A drawer of foreign ministry invitations contained duplicate notes, some altered by 1 or 2 words whose impact would have been invisible to casual readers and significant to diplomats. A memorandum concerning Azkaban staffing had been annotated in a hand that was not Fudge's. A rejected proposal regarding Muggle-born outreach had vanished entirely, leaving only the registry line where it should have been logged. Not just listening, Amelia said, joining him. Steering? Yes. For policy? For trust. He handed her 2 altered invitations. The changes were minute. Courtesy formalities omitted. A phrase softened here, sharpened there. Enough to sour a relationship, delay cooperation, feed a sense that Britain had become erratic or insulting. Amelia's expression turned murderous. Foreign confidence too. They were isolating us. Voldemort prefers frightened nations to allied ones. Rufus called from the consultation room. Found another compartment. It was in the dining room wainscot, accessible only if one pressed a silver grate motif while standing at exactly the correct angle. Inside rested a second thorn-sealed packet and a small notebook written mostly in initials. Several entries referred to gifts, recommendations, private assurances. One referred to the minister's dependence on calm language. Another to continued usefulness of educational spectacle. A later note, more hurried, stated, if public confirmation occurs, direct denial impossible. Shift to internal paralysis. Internal paralysis, Rufus repeated. Meaning? Confusion, said Amelia. Competing reviews, mistrust, lost authority. If the truth came out, the ministry was supposed to freeze. Dumbledore let the notebook close in his hand. Tonight, it will not. Fudge, who had followed them in despite his own dread, stared at the page. They wrote about me. Yes, Dumbledore said. They studied me. Yes. His face trembled with something too humiliated to be rage. They used me. Dumbledore did not answer because false comfort there would have been insult. Of course, they had used him. His vanity, his fear of disorder, his preference for reassuring language over harsh truth, these had not made him evil. But they had made him terribly usable. Fudge seemed to understand that much on his own. He sank onto the edge of the dining chair and pressed one hand against his mouth. Percy stood in the doorway with a notebook of his own now open, and a quill moving furiously. Once or twice he stopped, shut his eyes, and went back over memory with deliberate care. Wilkes was overfamiliar with the foreign dispatch shelf, he said suddenly. Umbridge twice told me to hold school correspondence overnight, rather than send immediately. There was a cleaner, new, assigned after the Dementor hearing. She never looked directly at anyone. Amelia looked up. Name? Percy thought. I don't know, but she wore gloves in summer and her right hand shook. Find the rota, Rufus said. It's already being checked, Tonks called from the outer room. And whoever she was, she's gone. Dumbledore nodded once, unsurprised. A disposable link. The discovery of the Annex curse rippled outward through the ministry with the force of a new explosion. If the minister's private office had been compromised, no one's rooms felt sacred any longer. Senior staff demanded checks. Junior clerks burst into frightened tears. 2 undersecretaries tried to leave the building and were stopped at one point by Aurors too tired to care for titles. Somewhere on level 4, a respected committee head hexed his own secretary after accusing her of spying, only for the poor woman to be found entirely innocent and furiously articulate about the abuse of power. The building shivered with mistrust. Dumbledore accepted that cost without flinching. Better panic now than submission later. Better honest fear than false calm administered by hidden hands. He stood for a long moment in the consultation room after the dark plate had been removed, and the copying ward burned out of the floor, looking at the hole the curse had eaten in the wall. Through it the inner lath showed raw and splintered. Clean surface, hidden rot. It would have been almost laughably symbolic had the night not stripped metaphor from everything. Albus, Amelia said quietly. He turned. She held up the second thorn-sealed packet. This was tucked behind the panel with the notebook. Open it. Inside was a list of names, fewer than the others, written in a sharper hand. Not assets. Not vulnerabilities. Targets for placement once conditions mature. Several departments were noted. Magical law, enforcement, transportation, international cooperation, the Daily Prophet, Hogwarts Board of Governors. At the bottom, one line stood alone. If Dumbledore acts, advanced school operation via alternate juvenile channel. Tonks read it over Amelia's shoulder, and went cold. "Draco," she said. Rufus frowned. "Why? What?" Dumbledore's eyes had gone very still. "Lucius Malfoy's son. You think they'd use a child? I think Voldemort would use anyone, if the use were sharp enough." The room fell silent. For a moment the whole night seemed to pivot again, extending beyond the ministry, beyond seals and ledgers and hearings, toward Hogwarts itself. Toward the next phase already seeded while this one still bled. Amelia folded the list carefully. "Then the school is next." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "After tonight." Dumbledore looked toward the sealed office, the exposed ward, the weeping institution, the exhausted Aurors. "After tonight," he said, "nothing will wait politely for its turn." By the time the first faint suggestion of dawn touched the upper world, though none below ground could yet see it, the ministry had reached that strange exhausted hour in which the human face becomes truer than it is at any respectable time of day. Wigs had slipped. Hats vanished. Robes were scorched or soaked or buttoned wrongly in haste. Mascara streaked. Hair came loose. Fine diction broke down into plain speech and profanity. Men who had spent careers on polished distance leaned against walls too tired to perform superiority. Women who terrified subordinates by daylight now stood white-faced and trembling because their private office had yielded a hidden listening plate, or their departmental deputy had been marched away in chains. Authority had been stripped to its skeleton, and the skeleton looked very like frightened flesh. The atrium, once more the heart of events, had become assembly ground, triage station, holding pen and witness chamber all at once. The broken fountain remained where it had fallen, a monument to the night that had shattered not only stone but denial. Water still ran from cracked pipes in glittering threads over the marble. Aurors had set ward stakes around the most dangerous debris. The dead had been removed. The wounded had mostly been seen to. In their place now stood rows of prisoners bound under guard, some defiant, some collapsed inward, some staring around with the dazed incomprehension of people who had believed themselves components of machinery rather than human beings answerable for what their motions achieved. Above them, clerks and departmental workers crowded the galleries, summoned by the bells or too afraid to hide in offices any longer. They spoke in low voices that turned the vast hall into a hive of dread. When a new prisoner was brought in and recognized, the murmuring surged. Once a witch on the second balcony cried out, "He was at my wedding," and had to be steadied by the people beside her. Amelia Bones stood before the central line of detainees, with a parchment roll in hand. She had not slept. Her hair had wholly come loose. The lines around her mouth looked carved. She also appeared more formidable than at any point in her considerable career. "We have," she said, voice carrying cleanly through the atrium, "secured or identified 23 ministry employees directly connected to Death Eater operations, dark object concealment, evidence suppression, or hostile infiltration. We have placed 14 under binding arrest. 3 are dead resisting custody. 5 remain under active hunt inside or immediately adjacent to ministry property. Additional persons are detained pending review for coercion, complicity, or material assistance." None. The murmuring swelled and broke. Amelia did not care. "All interdepartmental correspondence is frozen until vetted. All private offices on levels 1 through 4 are sealed until searched. Any attempt to destroy records, communicate without authorization, or interfere with investigative process will be treated as obstruction during wartime and answered accordingly." Answered accordingly from Amelia Bones sounded less like policy than prophecy. Rufus moved through the aura lines, checking readiness. He had redistributed teams, placed fresh guards on prisoners whose sleeves still hid the mark, and quietly removed 3 officials from command pending review of their connections. He would later deny it if asked, but he had also ordered the old bronze gates at the atrium entrances physically barred in addition to magical seal. There were moments when symbolism mattered. Let those inside understand that stone, iron, and wand agreed upon the same point. Fudge had not resumed the center. He stood slightly behind and to one side of Dumbledore now, An arrangement no one mentioned because to mention it would have made it unbearable. His face had collapsed into age. He held his hat in both hands. The Minister for Magic, who had once feared above all else the appearance of losing control, now looked like a man who had learned there were conditions more shameful than being seen weak, being seen hollow among consequences. Percy remained near him with a sheaf of notes so thick and cramped with writing that the top pages shook from the pressure of his hand. At some point, he had gone from stunned obedience into a species of desperate competence. Names, access lists, timings, recollections, the minutiae of a bureaucracy turned suddenly into a field report. When Honora Captain asked who had last authorized the replacement cleaner rota in the minister's annex, Percy answered without checking. When Amelia demanded dates for Wilkes' irregular leave, Percy supplied them. He was pale with self-disgust and running on purpose alone. Dumbledore stood facing the ruined fountain. In the hours since sealing the ministry, he had not once permitted himself stillness longer than a breath. Now at last, he stood with his wand lowered and a single length of parchment in hand. Fawkes perched on a shattered pillar above him, red gold against marble and smoke. The phoenix had sung twice in the night, once in the drains, once over the courtroom when an elderly Wizengamot member had collapsed from shock and grief. Each time the sound had held the whole building together for a few heartbeats more. "What is that?" Fudge asked hoarsely, looking at the parchment. "A statement," Dumbledore said. "For the press. For Britain." Fudge gave a brittle laugh. "You intend to announce this before we have total control?" Dumbledore turned his head slightly. "We will never again have total control, Cornelius. That was illusion, and costly illusion at that. We require trust now, not pretense." "Trust," Fudge repeated. "After this? Because of this." Amelia approached in time to hear the last exchange. "He's right." Fudge looked at her as though betrayed by physics. She was unmoved. "If we bury this, we finish the work they began. The public will learn there were Death Eaters in the ministry. They will learn we found them. They will learn how. They will learn who resisted and who acted. No, and who failed," Fudge said quietly. No one contradicted him. Rufus joined them. "The Daily Prophet?" "We'll receive a copy," said Dumbledore. "So will every respectable paper and foreign office to which the ministry owes confidence. The Prophet no longer gets to decide what the country knows first. That'll make some people unhappy." Dumbledore looked almost amused. "That is a small hope on which to build." A disturbance rose at the far entrance. Two Aurors marched in another prisoner, this one still half in sleep clothes beneath a hastily thrown cloak, hair damp with sweat, face contorted in furious disbelief. Assistant Undersecretary Wilkes at last. He had been found hiding, not heroically, but in a sealed broom cupboard on level 3 behind 2 nesting cleaning charms, and a charm to mimic disuse. The sight of him broke whatever lingering idea remained that conspiracy wore dramatic faces. Wilkes looked exactly like a bureaucrat who had misplaced a budget report and intended to complain to someone senior. He saw Fudge and began at once. "Minister, this is outrageous. I insist." Amelia held up one hand. "Nah, a word." He looked instead at Dumbledore, and hatred sharpened his features. "You sanctimonious meddler. You think because the old madman was seen in a public hall you can storm the ministry like some crowned savior." "Roll up his sleeve," Rufus said. Wilkes went dead still. That stillness told the galleries everything before the Aurors touched him. "No," he said. "No, absolutely not. This is indecent. I am a senior." The sleeve came up. There was no mark. A rustle of confused whispering moved through the hall. Amelia's gaze did not shift. "Other arm." "Don't be absurd." The second sleeve came up, and there too was no skull and serpent, only pale skin mottled with strain. Wilkes managed a laugh then, shaky and triumphant. "There, you see. There, Minister, you see what this has become? Bassless hysteria. Political revenge. Old men and frightened women making examples of staff. Open his collar, Dumbledore said. Amelia looked sharply at him. Wilkes blanched. Rufus stepped in and yanked the man's high collar aside. Behind his ear, just at the hairline, lay a small black thorn symbol, burned into flesh no larger than a thumbnail. Tonks from the side muttered, "Bloody hell." Dumbledore's eyes remained on Wilkes. Secondary custodian. The man's bravado disintegrated. For 1 second it fell away, and the thing underneath showed bare. Fanaticism without grandeur, a clerk's soul lit by the obscene pleasure of serving power while appearing harmless. "It was only meant," he said, almost pleading with the air itself, "to carry instructions if the larger channel failed." Amelia took 1 step closer. "From whom?" Wilkes's eyes moved involuntarily left. Everyone in the atrium followed the glance. Not to Fudge. Not to Umbridge's now empty office level. To a quiet, graying witch in modest ministry robes standing among the second-row clerks on the East Gallery, hands clasped as though attending an unpleasant sermon. She had not been named all night. No one notable. No title worth remembering. She froze beneath the weight of all those eyes, and then, with terrible speed, raised her wand toward the nearest line of spectators. Dumbledore was faster. The disarming spell hit her before she could finish the incantation. Her wand flew. Kingsley, who had just emerged from a side corridor carrying fresh reports, saw movement and acted without needing explanation. He apparated the legal inch allowed within Dumbledore's emergency ward, more magical wrench than a true apparition, and seized her by the throat and arm before she toppled from the balcony. Her sleeve tore in the struggle. The mark gleamed black as oil. The atrium exploded in sound. Cries. Shouts. Someone screaming that she worked in payroll. Another shouting that she'd overseen pension adjustments for 15 years. The witch herself tried to bite Kingsley's hand and earned a stunning spell for the effort. Dumbledore exhaled slowly. There. Amelia's jaw tightened. How many quiet ones? "Enough," said Dumbledore. "That we must assume obscurity was a chosen advantage, not absence." The revelation spread through the galleries like cold poison. Clerks who had thought themselves safely peripheral now stared at one another with new suspicion. Quiet positions. Payroll. .I. Archives. Standards review. Cleaning rosters. Maintenance. The hidden government had worn plain faces on purpose. Amelia signaled sharply. More aurors moved to the galleries. Fudge looked sick. "They were all around me." "Yes," Dumbledore said. The minister shut his eyes. When he opened them again, something had changed. Not enough to make him admirable, perhaps not enough even to save his office, but enough that when he spoke next, the words did not come from vanity. "Read the statement," he said. Dumbledore studied him a long moment. Then he turned to the atrium and raised his wand. Silence rolled outward in visible waves, softening shouts, stilling whispers, carrying attention from gallery to floor until the whole wounded ministry listened. His voice, when it came, was not amplified theatrically. It was merely pitched with perfect clarity. "Tonight, the Ministry of Magic has confirmed the return of Lord Voldemort. Tonight also, within these walls, we have uncovered and arrested servants of that same enemy embedded in offices of state. Some bore the dark mark openly hidden beneath official robes. Some served without it. Some corrupted records, movements, hearings, and the administration of law. Their work was to weaken confidence, isolate the innocent, protect the guilty, and prepare this country to surrender by confusion before it could be forced by fear." Faces in the gallery changed as the words named what they had only half understood. "This has occurred," Dumbledore continued, "because lies were preferred to upheaval, because warning was mistaken for disloyalty, because people of conscience were mocked while those who promised comforting order were trusted too easily. Let no one leave this hall imagining that darkness enters a government only by siege. More often, it is invited in through caution, terrorism, And the wish not. Amelia stood like carved stone. Rufus's one good shoulder squared. Fudge listened as though each sentence were a public measure of his own failure, which in part it was. "But hear also this," Dumbledore said. "The Ministry has not fallen tonight. It has awakened. Those who served Voldemort from hidden desks and hidden rooms are being dragged into light. Records are preserved. Roots are sealed. The law abused in secrecy will now answer in the open. Every department will be searched. Every compromised office will be named. Every family threatened by these schemes will be warned." The bell tolled once more overhead. We do not choose the hour in which truth becomes unavoidable. We choose only whether to stand aside when it arrives. Tonight, many here have chosen to stand. No. He lowered the parchment. For one immense heartbeat, the atrium held quiet. Then the sound that rose was not cheering. It was something rougher, more uncertain, and far more real. The collective exhale of people who had lived too long under falseness and found, in its breaking, terror mixed with relief. The war was no less terrible for being acknowledged. But it had been named. And names, Dumbledore knew, were where battles often truly began. The nearest thing the Ministry ever had to sunrise came not from windows but from enchantment. Far above the atrium, the ceiling that mirrored weather and time began, by ancient habit, to lighten. Black gave way first to deep indigo, then to a color like cold ink washed thin with water. The ruined hall, drenched and smoke-marked and full of guards, prisoners, clerks, and exhausted officials, was gradually touched by a dim false dawn. It caught on puddles and broken gold. It silvered the edges of shattered marble. It turned the steam rising from wet robes into ghost breath. It was nearly over. Not the war. Never that. Only the night. Prisoners were led away in groups under double escort. Those with the mark received iron restraints layered with anti-curse bindings and wandless suppression charms. Others were separated according to charge and danger. A special holding sequence had been improvised in the old lower vaults, because no one trusted the usual routes to Azkaban yet. Healers moved among the spent and injured with brisk, unsentimental mercy. House elves, once permitted past the outer ward by Dumbledore's explicit instruction, had begun the grim work of mopping water and blood from the edges of the hall while muttering to one another about wickedness in government. The ordinary life of institution, stubborn and practical, was already asserting itself over catastrophe. But no one would ever again mistake that practical life for innocence. Amelia Bones stood near the central desk, now erected from two broken hearing tables, and was dictating the next sequence of warrants to 3 quills at once. Her voice was hoarse. Her eyes were bloodshot. She had the air of a commander who knew the battle had not ended so much as changed geography. Rufus Scrimgeour, having finally allowed a healer to seal the cut in his shoulder, was organizing the first external raids based on addresses recovered from the hidden archive and Macnair's vault. Every hour delayed would now be a gift to the scattered network. He intended to give no gifts. Kingsley, face set in gray fatigue, had gone to oversee the secure transfer of the most dangerous captives. Tonks, hair now a stubborn dark purple as exhaustion lost the strength to keep it brown, was carrying boxes of copied evidence to the triple-sealed archive and arguing with a clerk who thought chain of custody forms ought to wait until after breakfast. Percy Weasley, astonishingly, had become indispensable. He moved with the shell-shocked intensity of a man who had found redemption hidden inside clerical precision and meant to wring from memory every useful fact he had ever ignored. More than once Amelia had barked for a date or access list, and Percy had answered before the ink dried on the question. Fudge stood apart. No one had ordered him there. No one had asked him to leave. He had simply drifted to the edge of his own ministry and remained as though unsure by what right he still occupied space within it. The breakage around him, the fountain, the scorched walls, the lines of chains, the sealed fireplaces, seemed to accuse him merely by existing. Yet he had not fled. Dumbledore noted that. It was not absolution, but neither was it nothing. The old wizard himself had withdrawn a little from the machinery of the aftermath. Not because he was less necessary than the others, but because the ministry, if it were to survive, must remember by morning that its rescue had not been one man performing greatness upon a stage. It had been choices. Amelia's refusal to blink, Rufus's refusal to delay, Kingsley's steadiness, Tonks's nerve, even Percy's late-earned courage. Governments rotted through collective compromise. They were restored, if at all, through collective resolve. Dumbledore stood beside the wreck of the fountain and let the false dawn touch his face. Weariness had finally found him. It sat in the slope of his shoulders, in the fine lines around his eyes, in the slight slowing of his breath when no one addressed him. Sirius was dead. Harry was grieving. Voldemort knew now beyond doubt that Dumbledore had not merely opposed him but moved decisively to tear his hidden hand from the state. Reprisals would come. The school would need guarding. Snape would need impossible explanations. Lucius Malfoy's household, already shaken, would harden or crack under pressure. Draco's name, written in the annex list like a shard of the future, would not leave his thoughts. He had won a night and opened 100 dangers. Fawkes descended soundlessly and settled upon the broken shoulder of one fallen golden statue. The phoenix eyes, ancient and bright, regarded him with that impossible blend of creaturely affection and almost inhuman comprehension that had so often in Dumbledore's life felt like grace briefly made feathered. "Well," Dumbledore murmured. Fawkes made a low sound. Not song, but acknowledgement. Behind him, soft steps approached. He did not turn until Remus Lupin's voice said, "Moody has Harry." Dumbledore closed his eyes once. And he would not sleep. No. He asked what you had begun. Dumbledore looked at the ruined hall. "Tell him the truth." Remus came to stand beside him, face gray with grief scarcely less raw for having had a few more minutes to settle into his bones. Serious loss lived in the set of his mouth, the hollowness beneath his eyes. Yet when he took in the atrium, the prisoners, the Aurors, the stunned clerks, something like stunned understanding joined the grief. "You did it," he said. "We did enough to make the next part inevitable." Remus's gaze moved to Fudge, to Amelia, to the chained line where Wilkes stood staring hate through bruised eyes. "This will tear the country in half." "It was already in halves," said Dumbledore. "Tonight merely removed the curtain." Remus drew a long breath. Sirius would have liked that answer. A shadow passed over Dumbledore's face so swift and painful it might have been missed by anyone who did not love him. He would have preferred I had acted earlier. Remus said nothing. Because there are griefs so exact a reply becomes intrusion. After a moment, Dumbledore handed him a folded copy of the public statement. "Take this to Grimmauld Place. Copies are going to the Prophet, the Quibbler, and every foreign contact I trust. I want the truth moving faster than rumor for once." Remus accepted it. "And Hogwarts?" "McGonagall is to strengthen all entry wards at once. No outside contractor, ministry approved or otherwise, enters the grounds without my express authority. Severus must come to me before nightfall. We have matters to discuss." Remus hesitated. "About Draco?" Dumbledore looked at him sharply. Remus lifted one shoulder. "I know that face." For a second, incredibly, Dumbledore almost smiled. "Then yes. About Draco." He watched Remus go, coat snapping softly behind him, and turned back to the atrium just as Amelia approached carrying 3 fresh warrants and a look that brooked no philosophizing. "We've identified the cleaner from the Annex Rota," she said. "False identity, of course, but the real woman disappeared 4 months ago, and the imposter came with forged references tied to one of the old families. There are also 6 houses we need hit before breakfast, and 1 press office I'd dearly like to seize on principle alone." "Restrain the principle," Dumbledore said. Amelia snorted once. "I knew you'd say that." Rufus joined them, tucking a list into his inner pocket. "Foreign office owls are prepped. Aura teams moving in 20 minutes. There'll be resistance." "Yes," said Dumbledore. Rufus glanced toward the dimming stars of the enchanted ceiling. You realize he'll answer this hard. I do. And if he hits the Ministry publicly? Then we meet him publicly. Rufus studied him a moment longer. You've changed the board. No, Dumbledore said quietly. I've only turned it so everyone can see the pieces. Amelia followed his gaze upward. And Cornelius? Fudge, as though hearing his name in the turn of silence, looked over. For the first time in a year, there was no outrage in his expression. No offended authority. Only naked fatigue and a growing comprehension that office might not survive truth. Dumbledore considered. That is for him, and for Britain. Diplomatic. Temporary. Amelia almost smiled. I thought so. She left to issue orders. The atrium thinned gradually as assignments drew people away. More aurors departed on raids. Clerks were dismissed in controlled groups after one check and statement taking. Healers levitated the last of the heavy debris aside to clear a route. House elves muttered over the ruined fountain and made worried sounds about whether marble could ever quite forget dark curses. The bells ceased at last. And in the quieter hall, with dawn now pale across the enchanted ceiling, Dumbledore walked alone to the very center of the broken fountain, where Voldemort had stood, and where Fudge had finally seen the truth. The water around his boots reflected him in pieces. He thought of Harry's face in the atrium earlier, ash-streaked and ravaged by a grief too new to hold. He thought of Sirius falling beyond the veil. Of children at Hogwarts who would return in September to a world no longer able to pretend adulthood had matters in hand. He thought of Severus, who would now have to pass back into the heart of a darkness made more suspicious by the night's work. Of Draco, young and proud and frightened in ways pride never admitted. Of every quiet official who had chosen small cruelties because they could be filed and justified, and left no blood on the desk. He also thought of Fawkes' cry in the black tunnel, of Amelia refusing sleep and softness, of Rufus choosing action over institution's vanity, of Kingsley's calm, Tonks's reckless loyalty, Percy's late but genuine courage. Darkness was patient, yes, but so too, he reminded himself, could be conscience once roused. Roused. The false dawn brightened. It painted the remaining water silver. Fawkes launched from the broken statue and circled once above the atrium. The spreading light caught the phoenix's wings, until for a heartbeat he seemed less a bird than a living seal pressed against the morning. Dumbledore looked up. This is only the beginning, he said. The phoenix sang then, and the sound filled the wounded ministry with something that was not comfort. Not exactly, and not victory either. It was sterner than comfort, and cleaner than triumph. It was endurance made music. It was mourning that refused to kneel. It was the promise that broken things might still be made useful to the good if the hands repairing them remembered what had broken them in the first place. People stopped to listen. Aurors at the doors. Clerks halfway down the stairs. A house elf with a mop-eyed key. Percy with his frantic notes. Even Fudge, still standing among the ruins of his diminished power, lifted his head. When the song ended, the silence left behind was no longer frightened. It was waiting. Dumbledore lowered his gaze to the hall, to the work unfinished, to the war now fully awake and staring back. Then he turned, gathered his robes about him, and went to meet the morning.